Quantitative data can be processed for both Fullscan methods, where you extract ions, and for selective ion monitoring or SIM methods. There are a number of things that we need to do to ensure that we can process our data. The first is to establish either in the sample list or in our recalc list how we want each sample to be treated, whether it is a sample for analysis or whether it is part of a calibration or a verification, for example. This can be done either in the sample list before running your samples or in a recalc list in post-processing, and see our recalc list video for more info on how to do that. Once we've told the software how to treat each sample, we also need to make sure that our method is set up in order to process data as well. The way that we do that is by making sure that this post-run processing tab has been opened here and that we have added MS data handling. We can then run through the method, the calculations set up here where we have a number of options on which peaks we want to exclude, if it's an external or internal calibration, or just a simple percent. We then have a number of other options for pass-fail criteria, and for identification of unknowns if we are running a full scan or a Fullscan and SIM method. We then need to ensure that our compound table is full, and you can see more information on how to do this in our method builders and spectrum list video. Within the compound table, we then have the option here to set defaults. What we can do here is set up calculations, which will apply to all compounds. We can set the number of levels, how we wish it to be treated, is it linear, quadratic, if we want to ignore the origin point, to include it, or to force it, and if we want any weighting. We can also set the level of each calibration point, and also the units, and any thresholds over here that we wish to set. We have the option here under integration method to change the default integration parameters, so the window, how wide it will allow you to integrate, or the software will look to integrate, the peak width, the sensitivity, tangent, which will affect how the peak is integrated, and then the peak size reject as well, which will allow you to reject any small peaks that you're not interested in, for example. We can then also set a signal to noise threshold, and we can also additionally use this filter peak option to play with our smoothing parameters and our spike removal as well. Within the search method, we can then set a number of different parameters depending on the type of method that you have. So we can set the search window, so how far either side of your retention time that the software will look for your chosen peak. And we can then set different options, whether we wish to search it by the spectrum, the quantifier and qualifier ions for a SIM method, for example, or the nearest to the retention time, highest peak, first or last. I usually pick nearest to go with my retention time. We can then have search type as well. If we're running a full scan method, for example, we can use the library match spectra here, and we can set a match threshold and a minimum abundance here as well as a chromatogram mass window, plus or minus Daltons here. We can then apply and save these changes to our entire method once we've made a change. This will then mean that all of these compounds are processed in the same way, and this can either be added to the method before we run, so that once it's applied within the sample list it will be applied to all the compounds, or we can apply these changes in our recalc list. So for example, if we work our way from our recalc list here, in this window plot chromatograms and spectra, and then we can move to our process data, and we can see more information in our recalc list video on how we can use this tab. We can then process this data according to this recalc list and according to the conditions set within the method. So we can see here I have a linearity and then a QC sample here. This has now processed the data as I've set by the processing rules on the right hand side here, and I can now move to the final tab, View Results. This will then open the View Results tab, and there are a number of different things that we can do here. So we can easily move from sample to sample. We can change how we filter. Personally, I like to filter by peak name, you can see here, and then I can easily process or review the same compound for all of my different samples here. Here in this tab, we can see our quantifier ion and our two qualifiers. We can change whether we want to see these qualifier plots by clicking here to see the main plot. If we had a Fullscan method included as well, we could show the TIC plot. So this is a SIM method, so we're just seeing our SIM windows here. We can show our background correction markers if we so desire. And we can change whether if we have our qualifiers shown, whether we want them overlaid, so we can see them relative to our quantifier peak, or if we want them normalized or stacked like so. We then have a number of manual options here. So we can have the left click set a zoom chromatogram, average the selected spectra, calculate noise, time range, or manually integrate. And this option will be enabled by then left clicking. So if I click on zoom chromatogram and then left click, I'm able to zoom in. If I were to set it to integrate and then I would left click, it would integrate my peak, overriding the automatic processing parameters and then changing the status here to show that it's been manually integrated. I can resume the view to the full scale by clicking here. Within this window, we can change what we see here through the Preferences tab down at the bottom left. So we can change which results we wish to display, the sort order, if we just wish to show unknowns, or if we don't want to see them at all. We can change the result list columns, so it has a number of predefined calculations and different variables that we can add and remove. You can remove certain columns, certain variables to simplify the workflow for yourself. We can change the panes to display. So the default is the integration chromatogram, as we can see here, and then any calibration curves and any calculations, as we can see here. And we have another number of other options that we can add with a maximum of 4. Manual processing, we can decide whether we accumulate our changes or if we just process them immediately. And then the data tree, we can set how we want the compound sort order. We can also change that within here. So if I wish to change by retention time, I can click my peak name, result type, etc. So if I have any samples have issues, so for example if they're missing or if they've failed, I can quickly review these. So I can see here I need to change my integration on my qualifiers as it's not picking up the qualifier. So it's failed on the ratios of my qualifier ions. We can quickly review our linearity and calculations here as well. So for example, within this tab, it gives a number of results here. The most important being my coefficient, my R² value, which is 0.99. I can see that this point here is possibly a spurious point, and I can check by removing it. So right-clicking on the calibration point, which will then remove it from the calculation, and I can now see that I have 0.998. I can then process by clicking this process button here, which will exclude this linearity point and recalculate any samples according to my new curve. I can also do this by going back to the Process Data tab here. I could either rerun the sample, for example, and replace it, or I could remove it that way as well by editing the recalc list. If our sample is set to a verification, for example, it will give our verification deviation, so how far it has deviated from the set level. This is minus 0.85%, so it's 0.85% away from the set result, so a good result for our QC, and we can set pass-fail criteria on this very easily. One thing to note that's incredibly useful down here at the bottom left-hand side is this edit function. This allows us to easily edit individual compounds. So if the default parameters that you've added haven't worked for all compounds, but work for most, then maybe you just want to edit just a single compound. So here we can work our way through. We can easily, in compound attributes, edit the retention time. We can do that by left-clicking, and it will move the flag there. We can change here as well if we've forgotten to add an internal standard, or we want to use a different internal standard, or group it. We can add that here as well. Now that I've changed the retention time, if I move to a different window, it will ask me if I want to update that time to the new time. I will then click yes. This will then apply this change to any sample within the recalc list and also to the method file itself. So any future data or any other data that is processed against that method will have this updated retention time. The quant ions, we can then, if it's a Fullscan method, extract new ions or combine functions. If we wish to sum our quantifier and qualifiers. We can also look at our tolerances. So if we're failing on our ratios, we may want to consider changing our tolerances. Or we may wish to make them tighter if a regulation defines that this must be the case. In the Calculations tab, we can then change the number of levels or how we treat this. So for example, if we want this particular linearity for 2-bromonaphthalene to be quadratic, then we can change it just for this compound. The integration parameters as well. We can now change the integration parameters just for this compound, which will not affect any others. We can also, up here, right-click to add timed events. So if we want to add more complex processing, we can add those here. We can change how it looks as well, fill in peak area, solid or hatch. We can make changes and then hit integrate here and it will update it so we can quickly see if what we've inputted has made a difference and whether we're happy with it. We can also change the filtering here, so if we wish to smooth this more or less, or remove less spikes for example, then we can do that for this individual compound here. The identification, we can change the search window. This might be useful if you have two very closely eluting peaks which share the same ions, for example, and we can change the search type here as well, just for that particular compound. Then if we're running a full scan method, we'll have a reference spectrum here, which will give us more information about the different ions and their expected intensities. At the bottom left-hand side, we also have the option for reports, with a number of predefined reports, and we can also edit these. And for more info on this, see our report video.